Hello, we continue our broadcasting from Kiev, and we are very happy that our guest today is Jan Brzezinski. He is former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense of the United States for Europe and NATO policy. He is a member of the Strategic Advisors Group at the Atlantic Council, an expert with decades of experience in shaping United States and NATO defense policy. Mr. Brzezinski, hello, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Ludmila, it's a pleasure to join you.
Thank you. Let's start with a very simple question. What should we do with this war? And how can we end it?
That's a very simple but
Yes.
also very challenging question. But surprisingly, I think there's also a very simple and direct answer. And of course, words are easier than actions. But in short, we should be leveraging the full power of the transatlantic community, the massive overmatch in power, and economic power, military power, ideological power that the transatlantic community has over Russia, to basically crush the Russian war economy and to break Putin's will and his effort to suborn Ukraine. We have it. Just think about it. And to me, it's almost heartbreaking that the transatlantic community, just look at NATO itself, has a combined GDP of $54 trillion. Russia, less than 2. NATO spends about $1.5 trillion in defense annually, and that number now, of course, is significantly increasing. Russia, amidst a major invasion of a neighbor, is spending less than $200 billion. So we're talking about a factor of 5 to 7. And then, of course, there's the networks the alliance has, the transatlantic community has globally into other economies, other military capacities, the alliances we have, our ideological legitimacy as a community of democracies. To me, it's absolutely stunning that the transatlantic community hasn't leveraged that to enable Ukraine to crush this invasion. And the moment we exercise that power, I'm convinced that Putin will quickly see that the territorial gains that he has made will be jeopardized. And he will quickly come to the negotiating table seeking a ceasefire because he want to protect those gains. That's how you end this war. And that's how you end this war on our terms, on terms that are just for Ukraine, and on terms that will ensure long-term military stability in Central and Eastern Europe, and perhaps in the long run, eventual peace and reconciliation with a Russia that will that will change as a result.
Do I understand right that now you say about your concept of a new Cold War?
When I think of a new Cold War, I think about the confrontation we have with Putin and his allies. Um, it's a Cold War because a Cold War had in a military component to it. It had an economic competitive component to it. It had an ideological component to it. And what Putin has sparked in collaboration with, or initiated in collaboration with China and with Iran and with North Korea, is basically an assault on the international order that has been the basis of peace and prosperity over the last 50 years. It's an attack on democracy. And that's very similar to the era of the following World War II. Of course, there are differences today, different technologies. It's more authoritarian. It's the axis of upheaval that I described of Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran is perhaps a little less communist and more authoritarian in character than the previous war. But it's still a comprehensive collision between two visions of what our world should be. That's why I'm comfortable with the phrase of a new Cold War. It's not perfect, but I think it captures the magnitude of the collision that we're experiencing.
You say that the West is strong, much more stronger and economically as well than Russia. But if NATO countries is so strong and in economy and military sense, why this war, last 3 years? And do you think that this is a failure of the West? What is the mistake?
Yes, it
What are the
absolutely
mistakes?
is a failure of the West. It's a moral failing, and it's a reflection of a very short-sighted uh, understanding of what's at stake, and it's a reflection that the West in a way has lost its will to fight for its principles and its interests. And the authoritarian side of the world, particularly Putin, recognized that and is exploiting it. I mean, the fact that we become so risk averse, we become so politically cautious. We're so afraid. Our leaders are so afraid to come to our peoples, our citizens, and say, "Hey, you need to make a sacrifice in order to protect the prosperity, the freedom that define our existence today." I'm actually convinced that, at least in the United States, that if we had a president who would do that, the American public would fall behind and support that. But we haven't the leadership that's demonstrated that kind of political will, and that's a tragedy. And Ukraine is paying the price for that. And if Ukraine fails, so to speak, we will pay a much more severe price for that because there will be a wider war. That's been the lesson. That's a lesson of history.
This war, Russia's war against Ukraine, uh, I think it changed many balances in the world. And what has to change in what the Russians call correlations of forces? So that the negotiation with Putin should be not a mistake, but an opportunity.
I'm glad you use that phrase "correlation of the forces" because it's a phrase from the Soviet era. And Putin is a leader from the Soviet era. And when he looks at his objectives, which is the suborning of Ukraine, a key step in reconstituting the Russian Empire, Russian Empire or Soviet Empire, I think he actually thinks more in Russian terms, but as a former Soviet official, um, he he sees a world in which the West doesn't have the will to truly defend Ukraine. And unfortunately, we continue to signal that we're not as committed as we need to be. And that creates an opportunity for him to drive forward. So to change the correlation of forces, as I was describing before, we need to exercise the full scope, the full spectrum of Western power. And, first and foremost, that means providing the Ukrainians as much military equipment as we can possibly provide them, with no restrictions on their use, including offensive capacities. The second thing we need to do is we need to body slam the Russian economy. We need to break its war economy. We have the capacity to do that. We have a 25-time overmatch in economic power, $54 trillion to $2 trillion. It's stunning to me that 11 years into this war, we still haven't exercised secondary sanctions to really cut off Russia's ability to resource its invasion of Ukraine through the sale of its natural resources abroad, particularly its oil and gas. We need to be leveraging the power of the truth. I mean, here is a leader, Putin, who's been penetrating our elections, disseminating false information, trying to disrupt our own democratic systems, and we've never really responded. And we don't have to use disinformation. We can weaponize the power of the truth. And two things come to mind for me is one, letting the Russian people know exactly what their soldiers in the field are doing. I don't think most Russians would be comfortable if they were made aware of the atrocities that had been committed against Ukrainians on Ukrainian soil by Russians. Second, we could have a field day weaponizing the truth about the corruption and authoritarianism and brutality of the Putin regime. just by flooding, quote unquote, the Russian space with that information. We don't do that. Those were, all three of those elements: military pressure, uh, economic pressure, ideological warfare. Those were key elements of our strategy to defeat the Soviet Union. We're not exercising them with the same degree of determination in our effort to defend Ukraine, and for that matter, to defend ourselves, because Russia's aggression hasn't been just against Ukraine. It's been against the transatlantic community, including through kinetic hybrid warfare, sabotage, assassination. Yet we haven't responded with sufficient aggressiveness, and it's disappointing for me, but it's also, to me, a reflection of a failure to recognize exactly what is at stake. Because the longer we allow this war to continue, I fear Ukraine will continue to be grinded down, and Putin will become only more and more aggressive in his approach towards not just Ukraine, but the West. So that's how you change the correlation of the forces. And Putin will respond. I mean, there's a great quote by George Kennan in his famous long telegram from 1946. And he wrote that the Kremlin is impervious, quote, impervious to the logic of reason, but highly sensitive to the logic of force. And for this reason, it can easily withdraw, and usually does, when strong resistance is encountered at any point. We're not following Kennan's precepts today. We should, and actually, that should be the fundamental principle that guides Trump's conversations with Putin tomorrow in Alaska.
Everybody expecting the negotiation among Putin and Trump. And Trump will meet Putin before this change happened. What do you think? Will this negotiation will be the experience in diplomacy, or it will be the strategic capitulation, as some say, even in America?
Well, with Trump, it's hard to predict.
Yes.
I was thinking about how to compare the public postures of the US government and that of the Russian government in the last, let's say, 10 days. And one is a posture of concessions, although it's evolving. That would be the US. And the other is a little bit more resolute in character, and that's Putin's. I mean, just think of the posture. First, from Putin, what's the Russian posture? Russian posture has been continued assaults, continued strikes against Ukraine, a continuation, escalation of the invasion of Ukraine, more massive drone and missile attacks, including on August 8th, the day of the deadline that Trump had imposed. Strikes not just against just the big cities, but the suburb of Kiev, including Bucha, which is, the site of some of the worst and most public atrocities committed by the Russians against Ukrainian people. Then, of course, he's escalating his ground force attacks in Donbass and Luhansk. Second, he continues to publicly mistreat those seized Ukrainian children. This is right days before this meeting in Alaska. The Zapad 25 exercise is not only going forward, but I guess yesterday or day before yesterday, the Belarusians announced that the exercise will feature the new nuclear-capable Oreshnik missile and other nuclear weapons. That's a highly offensive action. He's allowed to become public the testing of a new nuclear weapon, a nuclear-powered cruise missile. He announced last week that Russia no longer feels that there are, or will no longer abide by any limits on the placement of intermediate-range nuclear weapons. And then, of course, he's been consistent in his reassertion of his objectives, which is, Russian sovereignty over the entirety of Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, including territories that continue to be controlled by the Ukrainians. limits on Ukraine's military capabilities, denial of Ukraine membership in NATO, and removal of Zelensky from office. So consistent reassertion of his objectives, backed by assertive military actions and threats. And then you look, perhaps not going on too long, but you look at Trump. Well, he balked for the second time on his economic threats, didn't impose massive economic sanctions on August 8th. He suggested territorial concessions that create a visible discomfort in Ukraine and in the rest of Europe. His vice president asserted there's going to be no more U.S. military aid to Ukraine. He told Fox News that the U.S., quote, has stopped funding the war in Ukraine, and said, I think the president and I said, I quote, I think the president and I certainly believe that America is done with funding the military business in Ukraine. That's before these negotiations. His concessionary principles are, no NATO membership for Ukraine, territorial concessions. He's entertaining Russia's offer of U.S.-Russian collaboration in the economic sphere. A senior Russian official today or yesterday was saying that on the table tomorrow will not just be Ukraine, but potential economic collaboration between the United States and Russia. That's not a very strong, resolute negotiation posture to bring to the table, certainly in comparison to Putin's. Now, with that said, the good news is that Trump and his administration over the last week have been or appear to have been having extensive consultations with Ukraine and our other European allies and partners. And over the last several days, he's been reducing his statements have seemed to be intended to reduce expectations on what will be accomplished in Alaska. So, with those two different postures, there's continued reason to be concerned about what will happen in these meetings. But if there's a silver lining, is that Trump seems to be hardening his position over the last couple of days. So I'm a little bit more optimistic that it won't be a massive concession on Friday by Trump, but I remain on the edge of my seat, so to speak.
Do you think that Putin play his favorite game, escalation for de-escalation? Or do you think that Putin is interested in the stop of the war? Or no?
I think Putin has come to the table because he has always wanted to have the international recognition that comes with sitting face to face with the U.S. president. And he's got that, not just face to face president, but in the United States. Second, I think he probably was a little bit concerned about the threat of massive economic sanctions. He saw some movements by the United States that indicated kind of a shift in posture, the willingness of the United States to sell weapons to our European friends who again give it or pass them to Ukraine, a willingness to enable our European allies to get the front of the line in terms of receiving the production of weapons that they had turned over, their own weapons to Ukraine, so they could replace what they had given. That's an important step. He saw the sanctions being imposed on India. And so this is probably a cautionary effort. So one, he gets what he wants, which is a meeting with Trump, which is a win for Putin. He mitigates maybe what he perceives as a rising threat. And then he probably will try and use this meeting as an opportunity to pull Trump away from Ukraine and to create a division between Trump and our other European friends, between the United States and our other European friends. Those are his objectives, because if he's able to achieve those objectives, he can continue his effort to grind Ukraine into oblivion.
Take into account all this you say right now. Let's imagine that you are a Trump's advisor. And what recommendation would you give for him before the meeting with Putin?
I would remind him again of that long telegram and George Kennan's line, and I'll look at it again. Russia is impervious to the logic of reason and is highly sensitive to the logic of force. And based on that, this is an opportunity for Trump to look Putin directly in the eyes and say, I'm not negotiating here. I'm telling you that you need to have an immediate ceasefire. And if you don't, I'm going to step up our direct, I'm going to reanimate direct U.S. military assistance to Ukraine. I am going to impose massive sanctions on your economy, including secondary sanctions and further massive financial restrictions. I'm going to break your war economy, and we're going to start letting the Russian people know exactly what you've been doing. So exercise the ceasefire, get serious about coming to the negotiating table to end this war on just terms. And I'd keep it really simple. I'd keep the meeting really brief and say, that's the message I'm giving. I want you to see me face to face, hear from me personally. That's the message, and end the meeting.
Where is the red line in such negotiations that the United States can cross or must not cross?
Well, I would say a red line would be certainly no de jure recognition of Russian sovereignty over the territory it has illegally seized through the use of force from Ukraine. To make very clear that the international community, the United States, will never recognize Russian sovereignty over any inch, any square centimeter of Ukrainian territory that Russia has seized. That includes Crimea, and that includes the remainder of the territory that Russia has seized. I would make clear that if it was me, I would say we're going to make clear that we're never going to block Ukraine from acceding to the alliance. In fact, we think Ukrainian accession to NATO is a critical way to ensure enduring peace in this region. And I would say that there has to be accountability for Russia's, aggression against Ukraine. Those are three very important principles that have to be abided by. They may not be, I'd say, implemented as to the fullest degree that we would like in the near term, but we ought to make clear they're going to be ultimately fully implemented. Those are the red lines that I think are important to respect. And I wouldn't even call them red lines. They are the core objectives we have to achieve to end this war in a way that will, in the near term, ensure military stability and peace in the region and preclude this war from catalyzing other conflicts in the region and elsewhere in the world. We cannot have an outcome to this war that gives any potential revanchist or current revanchist the conclusion that they can actually achieve their ends through the use of force.
We know that America has its own interest, its own national interests. And what is the strategy, United States strategy towards the Russia? Just to, yeah.
It's not clear to me what our strategy towards Russia has been. Usually I am told that there was a Biden strategy for Russia, and maybe there was even a Russia strategy and Trump won. But it's never really been articulated publicly what that strategy is. My sense is that U.S. policy under the Biden administration was driven by the goal of managing rather than defeating Russia's invasion of Ukraine, because there was a true fear that this war could escalate, or there was, an exaggerated fear that this war could escalate if we overreacted. So we never had a strategy to enable Ukraine to win. We wanted to prevent Ukraine from being obliterated, but we didn't want to take actions, or we were guided by conflict management rather than victory. With Trump, I kind of feel it's been really initially a naive thought or ambition that they could quickly resolve this conflict and move on. Trump would be the quick peacemaker, and like in a game of Risk, he'd redraw lines of territory and all would be gone. All would be good. More recently, I feel that he's been driven by a desire to extricate the United States from this conflict in a way that has minimal political damage to Trump's reputation. That, of course, is also very different from a strategy designed to enable Ukraine to prevail in this war. So we don't have a strategy. I'd say another objective that perhaps is guiding the Trump administration is an ambition to have a reset with Russia. Throughout the 6, 7, 8 months of his administration, there's been constant flirtations with the potentials of economic collaboration, a renormalization of relations with Russia so that great powers could work together on other issues, treating as if Ukraine was a speed bump toward that objective. That, I think, is the guiding objective we have with the current administration in Washington. And it's disconcerting to me, and certainly it's got to be disconcerting to Ukraine. But Trump is unpredictable. If there's one thing he's able to do, he's able to pivot from one objective to another. And the good news is over the last several months, we've seen a kind of marginal shift in nuances in his posture. While I think he's still keen, first and foremost, on extrication and normalization of relations with Russia, for the first time, he is more regularly asserting that Russia is the one to blame for this war. It caused the recognition. It caused this war. He's been more willing to threaten economic sanctions. There's stories today that he's willing to contribute to some sort of deterrent capability that would provide a security guarantee for Ukraine, although the stories on that are a little bit vague, and so we need to learn more about that. But despite this kind of marginal hardening of Trump's position, I still think he's now really in a position where he'd like to extricate himself from this conflict and leave it to the Europeans to resolve and to manage in the long run.
For the leave to Europeans to decide this question. When we think about this war, it looks like this war is among Russia and Ukraine, and it's happened in Europe. And everything is understandable from the first point of view. But if you look for the allies of Russia, for example, North Korea, for Iran, and maybe for China, I don't know, but it looks like China support Russia in this war. And in that case, this war is not just about the Europe. It's about the sphere of interest of United States, for example, in Taiwan and with Iran, for example. And in that case, do you think that if Trump, as you say, leave this war for Europeans, do you think that it lead for the problem for United States and for United States leadership and for United States geopolitical position and for United States policy all over the world?
Well, let me just emphasize, first and foremost, recent press reports, including those today, have indicated that Trump is more willing to consider a role in some U.S. role in a transatlantic security guarantee for Ukraine. Now, I don't know what that means. I don't know how serious it is, but that's the first time we've heard that in a long while. So that's a positive thing. But to get to your question, if the United States were to abandon Europe and say, Ukraine, you and Ukraine are on your own to manage this issue with Russia, that would be a breach of a long-standing U.S. commitment to European security. It would be incredibly damaging to the credibility of the alliance, which has for decades, from the very first day of its existence, has been a US-led alliance. It would signal to Russia that the United States is no longer a reliable ally of its most long-standing alliance, NATO, and that is a message that would also be signaled to China and to other hegemons or potential hegemons and revanchists around the world that the United States is no longer a country that will stand by its allies, including those in the Indo-Pacific. So that would be probably an incredibly destabilizing act with global ramifications. And it would be surprising for me if Trump were to do that, because if Trump has one kind of driving ambition, it's to avoid getting the United States entangled in another endless war. And if he were to withdraw the United States in such a way, he would be unleashing the dynamics that could lead to not just wider war in Europe, but a global war, because there could be outbreaks of invasions and attacks and aggressions elsewhere in the world, including the Indo-Pacific, most significantly China's ambitions regarding Taiwan. And when you have that kind of global conflagration, the United States will be drawn into it at huge cost, as it was in World War I and in World War II, because our world today is even more interconnected than those eras.
Many years, the position of United States was to take away Russia from China. And now we receive the situation directly opposite for this policy. Is this mistake? And do you think that Trump will try to take away Russia from China one more? And do you think that it is possible right now?
You know, there's talk that some in the Trump administration like the idea of a reverse Kissinger. So Kissinger, you could argue, my father, when he was National Security Advisor, contributed to a normalization of relations, or led a normalization with their presidents Nixon and Carter, normalization of relations with China that pulled China away from the Soviet Union. And that was an important step in strengthening the West's or the international community's position against the Soviet Union, contributing to its demise. And so the reverse China, the reverse Kissinger, is to pull Russia away from China. Well, one, I'm not quite sure what we would get out of that, because we'd be aligning ourselves with a revanchist, an imperialist, and an authoritarian, a country that is led by a leadership that is a complete contradiction to what we stand for, both in terms of our values and our interests. And moreover, just look at the kind of the magnitude we would gain in that. We would be basically generating an alliance with a $2 trillion gas station. That's not even a very good one at that. So we don't really gain that much power in relation to China. So we don't gain much. We violate our principles. We undercut our alliances, because if we were to normalize relations with Russia, we would probably have to give in to every one of Russia's demands regarding Ukraine, which of course would lead to a collapse of the transatlantic community itself. So we gain very little, lose a lot, and probably leave China in a far better position.
How do you see the situation 3 months later, Alaska?
I don't know. It's hard to predict. I mean, it depends what happens in Alaska. I mean, if Trump does the right thing and follows Ken's advice and exercises the full scope of American power, I could see us in 3 months having, a ceasefire and serious negotiations designed to, fulfill the objectives of eventual territorial reconstruction of Ukraine, or the return of territory to Ukraine, a security relationship with Ukraine leading to eventual NATO membership. And that would that would be the basis for a more stable military situation in Central and Eastern Europe, and would lay the groundwork for an eventual, not near term, but normalization of relations with Russia. That, of course, have to be accompanied by reparations, the return of the kidnapped children, and accountability for the war crimes that Russia has committed against Ukraine.
Mr.
Let me just say, I don't want to be over optimistic. I'm not sure that's going to happen because it's very Trump is very unpredictable. But he certainly has the power and the tools at his fingertips, in his hand of cards, as he likes to say, to initiate a process that would lead to that outcome 3 months from now.
Let me ask the last question. Do you think the nuclear weapons matter in this negotiation and in this situation?
Well, they matter in that they are part of the context of this war. They matter because Russia has leveraged nuclear weapons to achieve its objectives in Ukraine by intimidating the transatlantic community from more robustly supporting Ukraine. So they're there. But I think they're really more in the background than they are as a critical issue that has to be addressed to put this war onto a path towards an enduring ceasefire and peace.
Mr. Brzezinski, thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you.
Ludmila, thank you for having me on. It's a real privilege.